Emma Hale had exactly one rule. For the 6-hour train ride from Boston to her sister's wedding in rural Vermont, no talking to strangers. She'd had a long year, the kind that leaves a person allergic to small talk, and she intended to spend the ride with noise-canceling headphones and a book she had no real intention of reading. Just a prop to discourage conversation. She did not intend to end up seated across from a man who would, within 4 hours, know more about her failed engagement than her own mother did, and who she would, against every rule she'd made for herself, find herself unable to stop thinking about for the rest of her life. His name was Daniel Cross, and he was reading an actual paperback, the kind of person who still dog-eared pages instead of using a bookmark, and he'd apologize so genuinely. When his coffee spilled slightly onto her book during a rough patch of track that Emma found, her carefully constructed wall of silence dismantled roughly, 45 minutes outside of Boston. Neither of them knew, as the train wound north through early autumn scenery, that a blizzard 3 hours ahead was about to strand them together for an entire unplanned night in a station house in the middle of nowhere. The kind of accident that would turn a 6-hour train ride into the beginning of the rest of both their lives. They were strangers when the train left the station. By the time it arrived, wherever it eventually did, they would understand that some meetings aren't accidents at all. Emma had spent the last year rebuilding herself from the wreckage of a broken engagement to a man named Marcus who had, 3 weeks before their wedding, admitted he wasn't sure he'd ever really wanted marriage in the first place, just the idea of it, the milestone rather than the actual life it would require. She'd spent the month since throwing herself into work as a hospital pharmacist, saying yes to every extra shift, filling every quiet hour so there was no room left for the grief to catch up to her. Her sister's wedding, the one she was traveling toward, had become a source of dread rather than celebration. The prospect of an entire weekend, surrounded by relatives asking careful, well-meaning questions about her own canceled wedding, questions she had no good answers for. Daniel Cross was traveling to the same wedding, as it happened. Though neither of them knew it yet, he was the best man, an old college roommate of the groom's, flying in from a consulting job in Seattle that had kept him too busy for anything resembling a personal life for the better. Part of 3 years, he'd been divorced young, at 26, a marriage that ended not in betrayal or drama, but in the quieter, sadder way two people simply grow into different versions of themselves. And he'd spent the years since building a career instead of a life, telling himself the career was the point, right up until the moment he found himself on a train with nothing to do but read and think, which he'd been actively avoiding doing for longer than he wanted to admit. The conversation started, as these things do, with something small, Daniel's coffee spill, his apology, Emma's reluctant laugh at the absurdity of both of them scrambling to save a paperback from a coffee stain. It should have ended there. Two strangers politely retreating back into their respective silences. Instead, Daniel asked what she was reading, and Emma, surprising herself, actually answered, honestly, instead of giving the clipped response she'd practiced. For exactly this scenario, and somewhere in the next hour the conversation wandered from books to work to, eventually, without either of them quite planning it, the reason Emma was traveling to Vermont at all. "My sister's getting married this weekend," she said, staring out at the scenery instead of at him, the confession easier that way. "I was supposed to get married myself, actually. 8 months ago. It didn't happen." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and something in his voice suggested he understood the specific weight of that sentence, in a way that surprised her. "For what it's worth, mine didn't happen either. Well, it happened and then it unhappened. 4 years ago. Different kind of ending, I guess, but I know the flavor of feeling like Everyone at a wedding is going to be quietly wondering about yours. That's oddly comforting, Emma admitted. Misery loves company, apparently. I prefer to think of it as solidarity, Daniel said, and the smile that came with it undid something in Emma's careful armor that she hadn't expected to give way so easily. They talked for the better part of 3 hours after that. The kind of conversation that unspools naturally when two people stop performing and start actually listening. Emma's work at the hospital, the particular exhaustion of watching people at their most vulnerable and having to stay composed regardless. Daniel's consulting career, built brick by brick as a replacement for a personal life. He wasn't sure he knew how to want anymore. Somewhere around hour 2, Emma realized she'd laughed more in this train car than she had in the previous 8 months combined. And somewhere around hour 3, Daniel realized he'd stopped checking his phone entirely, a habit he hadn't broken in years. Then the conductor's voice came over the intercom, apologetic and slightly strained. A sudden early-season storm had closed the tracks 20 miles ahead, and the train would be stopping indefinitely at the next station, a small stop called Ashford Junction that Emma had never heard of, and that turned out, when they disembarked into driving snow 40 minutes later, to consist of exactly one small station house, a diner that had already closed for the night, and no lodging of any kind for the roughly 30 stranded passengers now facing an unplanned night with nowhere to go. The station master, an older man named Walt, who seemed entirely unbothered by the chaos, set up cots in the small waiting room for the stranded passengers and apologized that the coffee machine was the only amenity he could offer on short notice. Emma and Daniel found themselves, by simple proximity, sharing the same corner of the waiting room, wrapped in the station's spare blankets, the storm howling audibly against the windows, the strange, suspended intimacy of an unplanned night that neither of them had any control over. "This is not how I pictured tonight going," Emma said, watching snow pile up against the window in the station's single working light. "I don't know," Daniel said. "I've had worse Tuesdays." It got a real laugh out of her, unguarded in a way that surprised them both. Not everyone stranded at Ashford Junction took the delay with Walt's easy calm. A retired couple 2 cots over, the Hendersons, bickered good-naturedly about whose idea the trip had been in the first place, while a young mother traveling with a toddler apologized repeatedly for the child's restless crying until Emma, unprompted, offered to help distract the little girl with a game she remembered from her own nieces, an offer Daniel watched with an expression he didn't quite bother hiding. "You're good with kids," he observed, once the toddler had finally settled against her mother's shoulder, asleep. "I have 4 nieces and nephews and a sister who calls me for emergency babysitting more than I'd like to admit," Emma said. "It's less about being good with kids and more about learning that distraction and patience solve about 90% of any crisis, toddler or otherwise." "That tracks with what you said about the hospital," Daniel said. "Staying composed while everything around you is falling apart." "I suppose it's the same skill, really," Emma admitted. "Knowing how to be steady for someone else, even when you don't feel steady yourself." She glanced at him, something more vulnerable slipping into her voice. "It's actually the thing I've struggled with most this past year, being steady for other people during the day and falling apart alone every night. I got very good at performing fine." "I don't think you're performing right now," Daniel said quietly, and something about the simple observation landed harder than any grander declaration might have. They talked through most of the night, the kind of conversation that only happens in the strange, unmoored hours of being stranded somewhere with nothing to do but talk, both of them peeling back layers they hadn't planned on sharing with anyone, let alone a stranger from a train. Emma told him about the years she'd spent rebuilding herself after Marcus, the particular loneliness of coming home each night to an apartment she'd chosen specifically because it didn't remind her of the life she'd planned. Daniel told her about the quiet, creeping realization over the past few years that he'd built an entire career as a way of avoiding the harder work of figuring out what he actually wanted his life to look like, and how sitting on this train, forced to actually be present with another person instead of his phone or his work, had cracked something open in him he hadn't expected. I keep thinking this is exactly the kind of thing that only happens in the stories my grandmother used to tell, Emma admitted somewhere around 2 a.m, the two of them sitting close enough, now that the shared blanket wasn't entirely necessary anymore. Just an excuse. Strangers on a train stranded by a storm, having the kind of conversation you don't normally have with someone you met 4 hours ago. Maybe it is exactly that kind of thing, Daniel said quietly. I don't really believe in fate, or I didn't 6 hours ago. But I also don't have a better explanation for why I feel like I've known you a lot. Longer than one train ride. The near kiss happened just before dawn, the storm finally settling into a quiet, heavy snowfall outside, both of them exhausted and unguarded in the particular way that comes from an entire sleepless night of honesty. Daniel reached over to brush a strand of hair from Emma's face, the gesture unplanned, instinctive, and for a moment, the entire station house narrowed down to the small space between them. Then Walt's voice broke through the quiet, announcing that the tracks had cleared and the train would resume in 20 minutes, and the moment dissolved into the practical scramble of gathering bags and boarding. Though neither of them quite forgot how close they'd come. They arrived in Vermont 4 hours later than planned, exhausted, and it was only in the chaos of the wedding venue's entrance, Emma greeting her sister, Daniel greeting the groom with the easy familiarity of an old friend, that the two of them realized, with simultaneous disbelieving laughter, that they'd been traveling to the exact same wedding the entire time, and had spent an entire train ride and an unplanned night as strangers without either one mentioning it. "You're the best man," Emma said, staring at him across the venue's foyer. "You're the bride's sister," Daniel said, equally stunned. "I feel like this information should have come up somewhere in the last 12 hours. I feel like we were both too busy actually talking to trade logistics," Emma said. And something in the absurdity of the coincidence settled into something that felt, undeniably, like more than coincidence. The wedding weekend that followed became its own complicated dance. Seated near each other at the rehearsal dinner by a seating chart, neither of them had influenced. Paired together in the wedding party by a groom, who had no idea what had already happened between them, both of them aware of a growing closeness that the entire wedding party seemed to notice before. Either of them fully admitted it to themselves. The complication arrived on the second night. At the rehearsal dinner, when Daniel's phone rang with a call from his Seattle office, an urgent client crisis requiring him to fly back immediately, the day before the actual wedding, threatening to cut short whatever this fragile, unprecedented thing between them was before it had any chance to become something real. "I have to take this call," Daniel told Emma, stepping away from the dinner table, and when he returned 20 minutes later, his expression had the particular tightness of a man facing an impossible choice. "There's a major account crisis. They want me back in Seattle by tomorrow morning. If I don't go, I could lose the account, maybe my whole position." "So go," Emma said, though something in her voice betrayed how much the words cost her. "Work doesn't wait for storms, apparently, even the good kind." "That's the thing," Daniel said. "I don't know if I want to go. And that scares me more than the account does." Daniel spent that night the way Emma had spent hers on the train, awake, turning the decision over. Except this time the person he needed to talk it through with was 3 years of built-up avoidance, rather than a stranger across the train aisle. He called his business partner near midnight, laying out the situation honestly for the first time in years. He was exhausted, had been for longer than he wanted to admit, had built an entire identity around being indispensable to a career that increasingly felt like the thing he was hiding inside of rather than something he actually wanted. His partner, more understanding than Daniel expected, offered a compromise. A junior associate could handle the immediate crisis with remote guidance, buying Daniel the weekend, provided he committed to a serious conversation about workload and boundaries once he returned. Daniel spent that night the way Emma had spent hers on the train, awake, turning the decision over, except this time the person he needed to talk it through with was 3 years of built-up avoidance, rather than a stranger across the train aisle. He called his business partner near midnight, laying out the situation honestly for the first time in years. He was exhausted, had been for longer than he wanted to admit, had built an entire identity around being indispensable to a career that increasingly felt like the thing he was hiding inside of rather than something he actually wanted. His partner, more understanding than Daniel expected, offered a compromise. A junior associate could handle the immediate crisis with remote guidance, buying Daniel the weekend, provided he committed to a serious conversation about workload and boundaries once he returned. He sat with his phone in his hand for a long while after the call ended, turning over exactly how much of his life he'd built around being needed by people he didn't actually love, at the expense of ever letting himself need anyone in return. It was, he realized, the same pattern that had quietly ended his marriage 4 years earlier. Not dramatic betrayal, just a slow erosion of presence, both of them so consumed by their own separate priorities that the marriage had simply run out of oxygen. He didn't want to repeat that pattern with something that felt improbably only 24 hours old and already more real than most of what he'd built in the years since. That realization, more than any single conversation, was what finally settled the decision in his chest before he found Emma the next morning in the quiet hour before the wedding, sitting alone on the porch of the venue's old farmhouse, watching the last of the snow from 2 nights earlier melt into the surrounding fields. "I'm staying," he said before she could ask. "I talked to my partner last night. We found a way to handle the crisis without me flying out today. I'm not running back to Seattle to hide inside a job. I'm not even sure I want any more. I'm staying for the wedding. And honestly, Emma, I'm staying because some part of me has known since about 4 hours into that train ride that I didn't want this to just be a strange, beautiful accident that we both look back on and wonder what if. I've been sitting out here trying to figure out how to say something similar without sounding insane," Emma admitted, laughing despite the emotion cracking through her voice. "I spent 8 months convincing myself I wasn't ready for anything like this. And then a storm stranded me with a stranger who somehow knew exactly which parts of myself I'd been hiding from everyone else, including myself. I don't really believe in fate either, Daniel. But I don't have a better word for whatever made that storm hit exactly when it did." She paused, glancing down at the melting snow at their feet. "My grandmother always used to say some people are just written into your life before you ever meet them. And everything before that meeting is just the universe finding the right chapter to introduce them in. I used to think that was just a nice thing old women say at weddings. I'm starting to think she might have actually meant it." "Maybe it doesn't need a better word," Daniel said, sitting down beside her. "Maybe some things just are what they are. 2 people who were supposed to meeting, in whatever strange way the universe decided to arrange it." He kissed her then, on the porch of the farmhouse, where her sister would be, married in exactly 4 hours, snow melting into spring green grass around them, and it felt like every mile of that unplanned train ride had been leading deliberately to precisely this moment. The wedding that afternoon was, by every account, beautiful. Emma's sister radiant, the groom visibly moved, the whole gathering warm with the particular joy of a family celebration. But more than one guest would later say the real love story of that weekend wasn't the one at the altar, but the one that unfolded between the maid of honor and the best man, who stood beside each other throughout the ceremony, with an ease that suggested they'd known each other far longer than the actual timeline allowed. The groom, catching sight of them slipping away together during the reception, cornered Daniel near the bar with the particular delight of a man who loved being right about something. "You two didn't think I noticed the way you kept coincidentally ending up next to each other at every single rehearsal event," he said, grinning. "I set that seating chart myself, by the way. Purely instinct. I had no idea about the train, but something told me putting my best man next to my future sister-in-law wasn't going to hurt anything." "You're a menace," Daniel said, though there was no real complaint in it. "I'm a romantic," the groom corrected. "There's a difference. Besides, if this doesn't work out, I'm blaming Amtrak, not myself." "It's working out," Daniel said, glancing across the reception to where Emma stood laughing with her sister, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the wedding itself. "I'm fairly certain it's working out better than anything I've planned on purpose in the last 5 years." A year later, Daniel had restructured his role at the consulting firm, trading the relentless travel schedule for a position that let him work primarily from Boston, close enough to Emma's hospital that they'd moved into an apartment together that spring. 1. Emma had chosen this time not because it avoided memories of her old life, but because it had a window seat perfect for reading, a small, deliberate echo of the paperback that had started everything. They took the same train route every year on the anniversary of that first ride, always slightly hoping, half joking, for another snowstorm, though the real magic, they'd both come to understand, was never really about the storm at all. It was about two strangers who happened to sit across from each other on an ordinary train and chose, against every instinct toward caution either of them carried, to actually see one another, and never quite managed to stop.